In the book of Haggai, God reveals that at a specific time in these latter days, He will begin to shake the nations. This shaking immediately precedes the second coming of Jesus Christ. Today we learn more about Haggai's prophecy and the timing of its fulfillment.
The Philadelphia Church of God presents the Trumpet Daily.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Trumpet Daily. In Haggai 2, God says He would shake the nations of the world in the end time. The word shake there means to be moved or agitated. It's something that demonstrates God's awesome power. It's not talking about a literal shaking of the earth or of stars and planets. It has to do more with prophetic events, with God's warning message for this world and His master plan for mankind. It actually has to do with your future. This world is tottering on the edge of colossal disaster. That reality is there for anybody to see, if they're willing. But God doesn't leave us without hope. In fact, there is an earth-shaking message of hope for those who will turn to God in repentance. Today on the Trumpet Daily, we bring you another segment from the Key of David, a weekly television program presented by Gerald Flurry.
Did you know that God said He would give us a sign of when He was going to shake the nations in this end time? He said there would be a sign, and all of that shaking would lead right up to the second coming of Jesus Christ. And God has already, according to this sign, started shaking the nations. And some of that is done in a violent way, some maybe not so violent, but still very moving and stirring events that would have a lot to do with bringing the nations down. Just before His second coming, of course, all of this happens. We have just written, or I have written, a new updated booklet on Haggai, and God has given some new understanding, new truth about what this little book means for us today. Now, I think it ought to be very sobering. It also should be as inspiring as perhaps anything we've ever heard, because it's all just tied step by step by step right down to the second coming of Jesus Christ. God does shake the nations in different ways, and He just keeps His church attuned to everything that's going on. I mean, in very specific ways and in very direct ways that we all need to understand. We're living in a terrible world. We see problems just everywhere. We're just deluged with problems. And we talk about often the nuclear weapons that are proliferating around this earth like a deadly plague. And that has to be sobering to us, but Jesus Christ talked about that almost 2,000 years ago and said it would happen just before His second coming. In fact, He would have to intervene and cut it short. How many people believe that today in religion, any kind of religion? Certainly, even in Christianity, you don't see much belief in that area, do you? I don't. Notice Haggai 2 and verse 7. And I will shake all nations. But when is God going to do that? I mean, He obviously has to let us know when and how. Or why tell us? Well, He's obviously going to tell us when. So let's take note here and see when God does let us know this. I will shake all nations, and the desire of all nations shall come, and I will fill this house with glory, the spiritual house with glory, the God's church, says the Eternal of hosts. So here is a specific and dramatic time when God begins to shake the nations. But we have to get the overview, and we give you that in our book on the United States and Britain in prophecy. It certainly lays the foundation for understanding a prophecy like we have here in Haggai. And it's all for this end time. So there is a definite time setting that I'm going to show you, and also a very specific sign that God would give this earth about when He was going to begin to shake the nations. And frankly, it starts with 3 nations. I mean, the specificity of all of this is just amazing. How direct God gets and how detailed He gets in these prophecies. And yet it seems like very little attention is paid to them. So when does God begin to, or in what time frame does God do this shaking of the nations? Well, let's look at Haggai 2 in verse 23. Haggai 2 in verse 23. In that day, now you can check the scriptures, and I think many commentaries will tell you this, but in that day always means in this end time. In this end time that we're living in right now, just before the coming of the Messiah. Many scholars, though, will tell you that Haggai is just history, or they're not even sure if it's prophecy. And that's just sheer nonsense when you read the words that are stated here, if you really believe God. It's amazing how those things don't seem to get through to so many people. Notice here, let's go on. In that day, says the Eternal of hosts, will I take you, O Zerubbabel, a man, my servant, the son of Shealtiel, says the Eternal, and will make you as a signet. For I have chosen you, says the Eternal of hosts. So you can look for a man in this end time that would be a signet. But what is a signet? What is that? Well, let me read to you from my new Haggai booklet, which we will offer you at the end of this program. It's now going to the press and to be printed. And I think will be finished by the time you write for it. If not, it'll be ready very shortly after that. But notice what it says here about signet. Why does God say He made this end time Zerubbabel a signet? Unger's Bible Dictionary defines signet as an impression made that had the same legal validity as an actual signature. In other words, I can sign a check and can be cashed without my being there. Well, here is a signet. There was a man that came to this earth and restored all things on this earth. And God says, I'm going to make him a signet. And that everything you do, after he's gone, and he's come and gone, then you build on that work. And his work and his message will be an authority, a signet of God's authority and God's signature, if you will, about how things must be done. So there is a formula that must be followed, or a specification that must be there, that others are to follow. Now, a little further down, let me read to you a little more about this definition. This is from the Anchor Bible Commentary, says this about the signet. The use of such a seal was the way of carrying out the authority of the person to whom the seal belonged. It is like using a king's ring to stamp a document. In this case, the leader is dead. And so you have to use this as a signet. It's like God's signature, frankly, because God did it through a man. So he says, all right, now this is all my authority, and I want you to follow what he laid down and taught, because he did restore all things in this end time. So there must not have been much there at all when he came, spiritually. This is an amazing prophecy. So in the booklet I'll go on to mention here that about building on his message and work, the whole idea of the signet is about God and his government. God reveals the signet's meaning only to those who submit to his government. The signet is an emblem or seal of authority, God's authority. Zerubbabel is the signet, but he is God's signet. The only reason you need the signet is if the person in authority is not there. So he's not here. But still, he left behind a message and a work, and it all has God's authority. If you're proving all things, you know that, and you can prove that. So this has to be a powerful work that this man did for God to even use it as a signet. In other words, everything revolves around that signet in the final phase of this same work, just before Christ returns. The second phase will lead right up to the very second coming of Jesus Christ Himself. That's how important it is to understand this. So you know there had to be a powerful work that preceded God's little remnant that conclude that work in this age, or the age of man, ruling over man. So there are two works, but they're tied together as one work, and it leads right up to Christ's coming. Let's see now a little bit more about Zerubbabel in this end time by looking at another end time prophecy over in Zechariah 3 and verse 8. And this is all explained in this booklet on Haggai that we will send to you, and I think you will just be absolutely stirred and moved by this little booklet like perhaps no other you've ever read and studied. And I hope you will study it, because it is just an awe-inspiring message from God Himself. Notice verse 8 of Zechariah 3. Hear now, O Joshua, the high priest, you and your fellows that sit before you, for they are men wondered at, or men of sign. They're actually a sign too, but a negative sign. They're rebels. And behold, I will bring forth my servant the branch. He's talking about, that's a capital B. The word is capitalized in the King James because this is referring to Jesus Christ. That this rebellion that happened after an end-time type of Zerubbabel died and the people of God rebelled, then they are actually a sign that, well, they're going to, that era is going to usher in the return of Christ Himself. Now, how important is that? This is that last or lukewarm or Laodicean era. And you'll see there in verse 1 of that chapter that the leader is in the bonds of the devil. And it's his fellows, Joshua's fellows, this evil, lawless Joshua, his fellows, and not God's fellows. But God is going to use them as a sign that Jesus Christ is returning as well. It's about the second coming. But He has a more specific sign of what is going to happen when He begins all this and shakes the nations. And He's going to show us that there's a starting point of that. There's a time when it starts, but it's all in the time frame of that signet talked about in Haggai 2 and verse 23. But notice what this all leads into. If you think this is bad news, think again, because here's the end result of all this. And it happens in that day. You see, in that day has some bad news, but it's all the most gloriously good news you could ever hear in its conclusion. Verse 10, in that day, says the Eternal of hosts, in that day again. You see, in these latter days, in this end time, it's obviously the end time. Notice what the context tells you that. In this day, says the Eternal of hosts, shall you call every man his neighbor under the vine and under the fig tree. So God is going to be here. He's going to be ruling. He's going to give every family a plot of land so they can have a wonderful, peaceful life, and nobody will ever disturb that peace again. Can you believe that? Can you and I believe these marvelous prophecies about what is going to come on this earth very, very soon? And the events have already begun. God has already started shaking the nations that's going to lead directly into that event. Now that's powerfully inspiring and wonderful information. And it all happens in that day, in that wonderful world tomorrow that God is going to rule over and bring this earth the peace that they should have had thousands of years ago if they'd only listened to God. Now, there's hope in this message. There's all kinds of hope, and this world needs hope. And God has given us hope, but most people refuse to believe it. They don't want to believe it because then, well, that might require something of them. They might be required to do something. And of course, they are required to do that. We all are if we're going to obey God. Zechariah 4 and verse 9, where it says, the hands of Zerubbabel, here's Zerubbabel again, and this end time type of Zerubbabel today, the hands of Zerubbabel have laid the foundation of this house, and his hand shall also finish it, and you shall know that the Lord of hosts has sent me unto you. So the Zerubbabel came on the scene and did a work. He restored all things. God said he was going to finish it. He did finish it. And then he died. And then then the church rebelled. And then there was a little remnant that had to raise up the ruins and really do a small version of what this end time Zerubbabel did. But in many ways with a much more specific and disturbing message in a way, but also much more specific in some of the wonderful things that are about to unfold. But it says, we wrote in the Haggai booklet that this is talking about a hands-on operation by a man in the latter days. That verse twice mentions hands, designated a starting and finishing of a project. The Anchor Bible Commentary says hands is literal and expresses participation in temple building. That is, it was built by God through a human being with hands, not built without hands, as Christ often builds and destroys. And the Scriptures say, well, it's without hands. But he finished his work, and another work then would come on the scene after this end time Zerubbabel, and that time frame is when God would begin to shake the nations. I mean, he's going to have to shake them to their senses. Until he can get some sense into their heads, he's going to shake them, and he's going to shake them just as violently as he has to get them to repent. That's what it's all about. Now, the commentaries will tell you that that section right there, verses 6 through most of verse 10, about 2/3 of verse 10, they are all an inset in this chapter about Zerubbabel. The whole all these chapters here are about a lukewarm area that came on the scene after Zerubbabel, and then God puts an inset there to show the people where they went astray and why they're not doing God's work and they're not being successful like Zerubbabel was. It says of him in verse 6, it wasn't by power or human power and ability, but by God's Spirit that he did that. It's the power of God was used to build that great work. And that's the same work that we're talking about over in Haggai 2 and verse 23. But let's conclude this here in Zechariah 4, verse 11. Then answered I and said unto him, what are these two olive trees, which is God, the Father and the Son, upon the right side of the candlestick, and upon the left side thereof? And I answered again and said unto him, what be these two olive branches? You see, there are two olive branches, two end-time works before Christ gets here. Two olive branches, which through the two golden pipes empty the golden oil out of themselves. God has just poured golden oil through two men in this end time and two churches in this end time. Golden oil. Wonderful, wonderful truth about this future. And yet men often scoff at that. Verse 13. And he answered me and said, know you not what these be? And I said, no, my Lord. Then said he, these are the two anointed ones that stand by the Lord of the whole earth. So these two different works in this end time. A Zerubbabel type, and then another man coming along and continuing the message right up to the second coming of Jesus Christ. And in that time frame is when God shakes the nation. But we need to look at that specific example of how God does that. We need to look at that. And now the booklet of Haggai will explain all this to you in detail. It is quite an in-depth subject. and there's a lot that I can't cover and won't bring to your attention, but in a way, the most inspiring part of it is in the booklet that I can't even talk about today because I don't have time to get it all in, and it's a little more difficult to explain and make clear in a short program like this. But God is going to shake the nations in that second work that is coming on the scene in this end time. Now let me just quickly go over another version of this same work because the time setting is the same. Now notice this, Matthew 16 and verse 28. Verily I say unto you, there be some standing here which shall not taste of death till they see the Son of Man coming in His kingdom. So this is a vision of the second coming of Jesus Christ, which is what I've been talking about throughout this program. But look at what happens just before that second coming. Notice what happens in that work of Zerubbabel, as it's called in Haggai. But there's another type here. The Bible talks frequently about types of men in this end time that are a type of men of the past. Verse 10, and his disciples asked him, saying, why then say the scribes that Elijah must first come? That is, before the second coming. And Jesus answered and said unto them, Elijah truly shall first come and restore all things. So there was, again, this same work. It's here called the Elijah work, telling us about the type of work it is, and the Zerubbabel work, about a building work. It just tells you the different types of one work. But it's all done through one man until he died. And then there's another type that comes on the scene, type of that a man fulfills in this end time in the last days when God begins to shake the nations. When He begins to shake the nations. So we're talking about, again, the very same work that I was talking to you about in Haggai 2 and verse 23. It's obviously in the last days, and this is the Zerubbabel work. But in Haggai, we're talking about the work that follows that Zerubbabel work. That is, and he becomes a signet because he restored all things. Obviously, God isn't going to restore all things again. So before the second coming, an Elijah type is going to come on the scene, and then he's going to be followed by another work talked about in Haggai. So let's go back now to Haggai 2 and verse 7 and see what that specific sign is that God gives us about when He's going to shake the nations, when it starts. How can we know when it begins? Well, because again, all that shaking is not just violently tearing them apart. It starts with very serious problems, but God is responsible for all of it because He's beginning to try to get our attention. And it's going to take a lot of shaking in many cases. And the more God has to shake, the more He'll shake. But we as individuals, if we let God shake us individually and get this message, then we're going to be protected from all this trouble that is going to come during the shaking of the nations. Notice, let's read verse 7 again. Let's read verse 7 again. And I will shake all nations, and the desire of all nations shall come, and I will fill this house with glory, says the Eternal of hosts. So here he says, I'm going to shake all nations. But when does it begin? We need to know when it begins. All right, verse 9, notice this. The glory of this latter house, this is a spiritual house, shall be greater than that of the former. In other words, Zerubbabel's temple wasn't nearly as great as Solomon's. But this latter house is spiritual, and it's much greater than both of them, both of those physical temples. So he's talking about it, the spiritual temple, or the people of God, the sons of God, that are more valuable than anything else, physical, obviously. Then God says, the glory of the latter house shall be greater than of the former, says the Eternal of hosts. And in that place will I give peace, says the Eternal of hosts. He's going to give peace in a physical house. And I'm going to show you here. He talks about the spiritual house, but then he says in this place. So there's going to be a physical house as well. That's why he says in this place, to let us know that. And in this end time work, there's going to be a physical house of God, just like there was a physical house in that era of Zerubbabel. Remember, we raise up the ruins and just in many ways duplicate the work of Zerubbabel. He was a builder. Zerubbabel built the temple. And this end time Zerubbabel was a builder both spiritually and physically for God. And so this end time work, when the nations are shaken, are going to be shaken also, builds a house for God, a physical house. Let me read that to you here. Notice God says, in this place, the meaning in Hebrew defines it as a physical place. In this place, God says, will I give peace. In this verse, God is discussing a spiritual and a physical house. That is why in this place is added. That way we can see it is also about a physical house. It's about a physical house. We have peace in this place. The context clearly tells us that there is a physical house on earth where God gives peace as He shakes the nations. That is a phenomenal prophecy. See, God builds a physical house. At the same time, He starts to shake the nations. Now, this will all be explained to you very specifically in the book of Haggai, or our booklet that we will send to you absolutely free, and you will find it one of the most stirring books that you've ever studied or read in your life. I'm absolutely convinced of that. So I hope you'll write for this book right away, and we'll send it to you just as quickly as we can, and I know you'll be happy you wrote for it.
Today's free booklet offer is Haggai, God Has Begun to Shake the Nations. Haggai's message was written for our time today, and as you'll see when studying this booklet, God has already begun shaking or stirring up the heavens and the earth spiritually, and now He's shaking the nations in a physical sense too. Just look at what's happening in this world. In recent months, the world has been plagued with unusual weather, record-breaking droughts and floods, earthquakes and tsunamis. Western nations are struggling for survival as the world economic crisis spreads. America is in decline. The dollar is losing its value. Gold is sky high. Mankind is on a toboggan slide toward oblivion. Human annihilation is staring us right in the face. The world is indeed shaking. This little booklet contains a sobering warning for all nations, telling us that times ahead will actually get much worse, but we have to see it all in relation to the return of Jesus Christ. God always gives people hope, even in this hopeless world. Call the number on your screen and ask for Haggai, God Has Begun to Shake the Nations, or go to thetrumpetdaily.com and download the booklet today. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you again next time.